Hey everyone, welcome to part 2 of M&A Business Integrations, Introduction to Post-Merger Integrations. So in the first video, we covered half of this deck. So basically, I provided what is a integration, specifically the post-merger integration, typically done day one or early on post-acquisition. I talked about some of the opening thoughts as to why it's such a complex area, even though it sounds simple, as to why people don't really understand it, and as to why most integrations fail. I then talked about the way we're going to address this very qualitative issue and understand the complexity is to look at a case study of a post-merger integration of two similar-sized companies and talk about some of the learnings and lessons from that. So we already provided the context, set the stage, talked about the benefits and risks of doing the acquisition at the time, and then covered the very first learning, which is around start integration planning early, and there's no such thing as over-planning when you're talking about post-merger integration. So the second lesson is around communication. So it's really, really important that there's ongoing communication at all levels and to both firms, and to touch on why and not just how. And this point's really important, even though it sounds obvious, is that because of that statistic we talked about earlier, where 80% of acquisitions or mergers fail, and the key reason they fail is because of cultural issues. So communication is your number one weapon against cultural issues. So let's talk about some of the common issues with communication in an integration. So the first one is communicating how is often done pretty well by companies, but it's the why that is often overlooked. So for example, the CEO is going to say, we are going to acquire this company and we're going to integrate them, and you're going to have to, share teams, then you're going to have to change your software, and, we're probably going to have to do training, and this person might actually be replacing your boss, right? So that's communicating how. But that might cause some issues because the staff is going, and most people don't really like change, right? Especially if it's hitting them personally, and maybe they like their boss, and maybe they like the old system. But if you were to communicate why as well, for example, yes, we're doing this and this is how we're doing it, but why are we doing this? We're doing this because this is going to double our size. This is going to improve the resources that we have, which means that longer term, we'll be able to hire more people in your team. We'll be able to create new teams, which is going to make your life easier. Because of this, we're going to be making the lives easier for the vets in our companies. Because those vets, they're the people that we're really doing this for, and we want to help them out. And it's also going to improve the value of your shares. And person B, and you have options or long-term incentive in this company. Therefore, the value of those shares is probably going to increase over time. Plus, we're going to be more profitable because we're going to get these synergies, and therefore, if the business is more profitable, that means the amount that we can have for bonuses is going to increase, right? So all of a sudden, I've taken that how, I've added the why, and people are going, oh, okay, right, that makes sense. And they're more willing to kind of take that pain in the short term because they realize this benefit long term. So it's really the why that's really important. And lack of clarity, especially from senior management on both of those factors, the how and the why, it often leads to a lack of focus and accountability amongst the team. Right? Again, similar issue, right? Because if people just understand the how, but not the why, then they're not really, they're not really going to be that motivated to do it. And if they don't understand the how, then there's not really going to be a very strong accountability, right? If we haven't said to the detail that this person is responsible for this, and each of you at the staff level are responsible for helping drive this mission, and this person is the integration manager, and it's their responsibility to check up on things. That's a detailed level of the how. And if you don't have that in place, then it's going to lead to people not doing their jobs or not knowing their jobs, and people not working towards their plan, and therefore you're not going to have progress. So the next common issue is that communications, when they are done, they're often delivered to senior management because it's the CEO, right? And understandably, the CEO is more biased towards communicating to his own world. He knows the chief marketing officer, he knows the chief financial officer, but he doesn't know the junior accounts payable person. He doesn't know the junior graphic designer in the marketing team. And if he's only communicating to his executive team and not the whole office, he's relying on that person to then communicate down, and A, they might not communicate it at all. B, they might not communicate it in the way the CEO wanted. Or C, they might communicate it, I guess, in the wrong way, which can lead to the wrong message. And finally, the staff at the bottom level or the middle level, if they're not communicated to directly, they might not feel like they're involved. They might not feel like they're part of this journey. And therefore, going back to that earlier point, you're going to have lack of clarity on achieving those goals in the team. And finally, there's often a bias in communication to communicate to your own company rather than communicating with target companies. So the CEO might say, well, team, we're acquiring this company, we're going to merge, but he might be silent to the other company, and then the other company's going to come in and they're going to have cultural issues and they're going to want to leave because they're not happy, right? So it's really important to communicate to both companies. Okay, so let's apply these issues to the MVC case study. So we recognize that there was an importance to communicate on the why, not just the how. And the key reason that we communicated on the why side was that this additional scale is going to allow us to help our vets better. For example, a new wellness plan. This is going to improve our ability to basically improve revenue. It's going to improve our ability for vets to increase their revenue per customer. We're going to have training centers, which is going to improve training for our vet community. We're going to have a more efficient ops allocation. For example, we might have 2 clinics in Tasmania and we've got a whole dedicated operations manager there. But because we're acquiring another 8 in Tasmania, all of a sudden we can then allocate the person who's maybe targeting 2 clinics in Tasmania and the rest in Victoria. They can now just focus full time on Tasmania. Right. This is just a small example. There were many other things, like we did focus on the longer term strategy as well. Like, why are we doing this? Because it increases, our ability to invest in the team. It's going to make the business more profitable and sustainable long term. So everyone's jobs are probably more secure. We're about to, more able to put up, wages for the support team. We're going to help our vets better. All these different things. We also realized that a lack of communication may allow staff discontent to bubble. So we tried to do as much communication as possible. So we set up recurring meetings, both at the executive level, but also the whole company. And we invited the staff from both companies to those meetings. So it wasn't just isolated as vet partners meetings. It was a combined business from the get-go. And by having that culture instilled from day one, from the top down, it then flowed through the rest of the business as well. Finally, so meetings invited staff from both companies. So for example, the finance team, we had both the NVC finance team and the Vet Partners finance team involved. So that allowed us to really start planning at the detailed level, and those teams to, at the divisional level as well, start thinking about their issues, the things that they need to plan out, and they could then communicate that up to the top if they needed to as well. So what are the learnings from the issues and the case study? So number 1, make sure people understand clearly and succinctly why the deal was done, not just the how. So focus on the why, not just the how. Some examples could be, what's the intended value of the deal? How does that improve security of jobs? How does that benefit the people in those companies and the customer base that you're serving? And what does that future look like for both of those companies? Next, appreciate that change is concerning, and really realize that your main weapon against that is communication. So communication alleviates concerns, particularly around job security. So the more you do it, the better off everyone will be. And finally, be conscious of any bias that you have, both towards communicating to your own firm instead of a target. So be aware of it and then try and do things to address it. So try and be as conclusive as possible in communications to both firms and to staff of all levels, not just the executive team, but include the junior people, the intermediate people, the senior people, everyone. That doesn't mean you can't have meetings at the executive level. It doesn't mean you can't have divisional teams, but just realize that if you only communicate at the executive level, you might have problems. So learning number 3 is cultural. Again, just reiterating this fact because it is so important that, 80% of M&A deals fail. And the most common reason for failure is that, cultural barriers pose significant barriers to the acquisition. And, if we're just going back to the earlier reference to NVC, we knew that NVC was ASX listed, so it was disciplined. VetPartners was laissez-faire. So that posed a significant risk to the deal. So what are the common issues of cultural? So number one, McKinsey, we mentioned this common statistic, so a little bit more background. So of 25% failed integrations, cultural cohesion was the key reason. So 80% of integrations fail, quotations mark, and of those, 1 in 4 was because of cultural reason, which was the biggest reason. So people issues are not really discussed at sufficient length prior to deal closure. It's often an afterthought, similar to the overall integration planning. And it's because it's so qualitative, it's so difficult to define and identify. Like, how do you define people's feelings, right? You can't put a number to it. You can't score it 8 out of 10 or 2 out of 10, right? You really just have to understand this person doesn't like this person has this culture, this person has these dreams, these person don't really work together. There are these duplicate teams and this company is doing it this way, this company is doing it this way, right? So it's hard to define that, but you need to really think about it and understand it and plan around it. So the third common issue, as I mentioned before, is that cultural issues are qualitative and can be hard to identify and define. And finally, the us and them attitude can often prevail and not we. So for example, it could lead, if you haven't done the steps previously, like the communication and bringing the teams together, you can have the NVC team going, oh, well, this is us. This is how we do it. This is the NVC guys and you're the VetPartners guys. But you really need to think about it as a combined business. So everyone is part of NVC VP, right? You're not NVC. We're not VP. We're all members of NVCP or whatever name you want to call it. So applying the facts to the case study, so there were strong cultural differences as we identified. So NVC was ASX listed, so public market, so it was lean, it was efficient, it was KPI focused team. And they had hired people who fit in that culture and they'd implemented processes to help them achieve that goal. VetPartners, on the other hand, it didn't have those same pressures, but, not saying that in a good way, it was just different, right? If anything, there was some different issues with that. For example, we probably had too many people, we were a little bit bloated from that scale, and maybe we weren't as profitable as we could have been. But then again, the vets were probably a bit happier because they didn't have that same pressure coming from us. It felt a bit more family oriented. Everyone was a bit happier. We probably had a kind of longer term tenure across all of our staff. So, there's definitely pros and cons, but the key issue is that they were different. And if you just bring them together without any planning, you're going to have clashes. And that's exactly what happened. So initially, there were some culture clashes when we brought them together. So, obviously every team is different, every person is different. There was no kind of consistent broad brush issues across the firm. But within some teams, there were some cultural clashes. So a big issue area was the marketing team, for example. So from my perspective, the CMO at VetPartners, she wasn't amazing. And I think there was definitely some pressures in her team. And the MVC team, they had some high quality staff and they had a lot of autonomy. And when they came together and all of a sudden this CMO at VetPartners, who was very authoritative, very hierarchical, and probably didn't have the same kind of, she didn't demand, you probably wouldn't give her the respect that you would for someone who's incredibly capable. But she demanded that hierarchy and that power over you regardless. So when those two teams came together, we actually lost a lot of the NVC marketing team because they said, well, I'm not going to work for that person. I had all this autonomy and I don't respect you. And all these people left, right? So that was a big issue. But yeah, with a lot of the other teams, we had a lot of success. Like HR and payroll worked really well. Finance worked really well. There were no issues. The operations team, I think they had some adapting to do, but overall, most of them ended up staying. So how we approached our integration strategy here was, not saying that, VetPartners culture was better, not saying that MVC's was worse, and vice versa, right? Instead, what we were saying is that of NVC, there were some good areas, right, that we wanted to implement across VetPartners. And in VetPartners, there were some good areas that we wanted to implement in NVC. So it was essentially a best of all theme. And I think this worked really well. And I would actually recommend this for other post-merger integrations because No company is perfect, right? Every company has some areas of improvement. And we recognize that, there were areas of MVC's rigor and processes that we probably did need to improve into vet partners. We weren't very, we could have improved our profitability. We could have had better systems. We could have had, less bloat in the business. And eventually we would need to do that anyway, like fix that up, right? So if we could implement some of that into vet partners, and if we could implement some of vet partners' approach to vet clinics and their ability to make those vet clinics happy into NVC, we would have a really great best of both worlds situation. And then finally, we were working together in these kind of joint project integration groups, and this was all after we'd completed the business, but we brought together these teams, and these teams were both from NVC and from vet partners. So this was at the divisional level, but also at the overall firm level. And this meant that, both companies' views were being respected, issues from both firms were being heard and identified, and they were working together, and they felt like they were part of the same organization already because they were in the same teams working together. So what were the learnings from all of this? So number one, provide time for people to assimilate these changes, right? It's going to take a while to do it, and make sure you're planning early. Next, don't take these issues for granted. Don't just be like, oh, it's just culture. Oh, it's an afterthought. Oh, it's not as important as the acquisition. It's not as important as the synergies. It is really important because it's the key reason why your acquisition could fail. So, do a full assessment. Don't treat it as an afterthought. Next, try and bridge cultural gaps. And a good way to do this is to assign short-term working groups from both firms to solve problems so they can work together as a team already and make sure that both sides are being heard. Next, try and quantify the qualitative factors. So a couple of ways you can do this is you can survey staff. So there's some tools out there like Employment Hero. There's lots of tools out there. And try and get a sense for how staff are feeling division by division, by seniority level, and by company. And that way you can really but you can really address any cultural issues as they're going, rather than letting it bubbling under the surface and exploding later into kind of staff walkouts, which are going to cause more issues. That's pretty much it. So learning 4 is around capacity. And we mean capacity in the sense that how will operations continue while that integration is taking place? Because integrations in itself is a huge task. Yes, you can have a small planning team, but at the end of the day, the people who actually have to implement those changes, whether it's bringing teams together, implementing software, negotiating rebates, implementing a wellness plan, hiring new people, communications, setting up meetings, hiring new people. There's hundreds of different areas across the business. It's huge time suck. So there's two questions here. How will you have enough resources to do all these integration tasks? And number 2 is, how will you ensure that there's still enough focus on the ongoing business and enough headcount so that this doesn't lose focus and attention? So the first common issue that we're going to talk about is, unless there's measures in place, the organization's operations will often take a performance hit during the integration due to capacity issues. For example, the operations team are focusing on, we've switched up their portfolio allocation. So now this person who was previously doing 2 sites in Tasmania and 8 sites in Melbourne, they're now just focusing on a combined portfolio of 12 sites in Tasmania. That means they've got new relationships to form. They've got to do a day 1 review of all of those clinics, and maybe they also have to onboard a new system, which is coming from across the other company. At the same time, they've got to get to know their new manager. They've also got to attend all these meetings, including kind of integration workshops and things like that. So during that time, all the clinics who are calling them up saying, I've got this issue, or maybe there's an issue which they hadn't identified, which is bubbling under the surface. All of a sudden, the revenue is declining in those clinics. Or maybe you get some staff lost in those clinics because they weren't being addressed. These are just hypothetical examples of how operations could take a hit because you're not actually focused on that business as usual. So the next issue is that capacity impact on the business may not be costed in. So, we might saying, oh, we're going to get an extra X dollars in synergies and we're going to grow COGS margin X%, but we haven't actually factored in, and this is relevant to the deal teams, the investment bankers and the advisors, we haven't actually factored in the risk of, well, what happens if revenue starts to go off because of that lack of focus? What happens if, our Ebitda starts to decline because of that lack of focus? This needs to be factored into the modeling as well. And finally, the extra headcount required to handle the integration and ongoing operations may not be factored into the cost of deal assumptions. Again, something really important for the advisors, for the private equity team, the investment makers to consider. Because what happens is we realize that the whole team is so focused on the integration that they don't have enough time to focus on the day-to-day business as usual. So what ends up happening is the case is that we say, okay, just focus on business as usual teams. We're going to then hire a couple of extra resources in your team, in your company, whatever it is, to just focus on the integration. And then we have to end up paying them maybe 3 to 4 roles, 150K each. Could end up being like 600K, fixed term contract. Where is this cost factored in? Have you factored this into the initial deal model? Probably not. So, okay, so let's look at the MVC case study. How did we go about this? What happened? So we ended up hiring additional resources to help take off the capacity stress of the broader organization. We did actually factor this into the deal assumptions, which is probably rare. Most people don't do this. It's probably something that's missed. So it didn't have much of a negative impact. But we probably ended up hiring them more of a full-time role than a kind of a short-term contract as we anticipated. So there probably was some extra value loss because of that. Next, we also did internal brainstorming and modeling on potential reputational impact from being too corporate and slowing the acquisition rate. So did it make sense financially? So, capacity on our ability to continue acquiring. Are we going to be too busy to do that because we're focusing on integration? So yes, we did that analysis, including as part of our last few slides. And it still made sense, right? So, but we were considering that out of the box consideration on capacity hit. And then finally, we did factor in some integration resource costs. But my learning from next time on this one would probably be to try and include more of this because yes, as I said above, there was some dollar impact on the business. Okay, so what is the learnings of this? So next is consider and model out hidden cost on the business. So for example, what could be the decline cost on the portfolio from lack of focus? So have we factored this in the model? Next, consider if integration capacity is enough in the business or if we need extra resources to be costed in. And yes, make sure this is factored into the original deal model so we're not caught later on. Next, current operations need to be included in the scope of the integration project to validate capacity assumptions. So if you're an investment banker and you're saying, we're going to get this benefit, we don't need to hire this person, therefore our EBITDA is going to be this. Go and check this with someone in the business who I guess you can speak to, first of all, due to confidentiality, make sure that's okay. But if you have found someone, make sure that they can sign off on it so that they're comfortable with those assumptions. And this is probably a learning for your general business career as well, because when you're doing a budget, for example, don't just do it in isolation, do it in conjunction with the team implementing it, because that's the way that you actually validate those assumptions. And then probably one more point, which isn't on the page, but after the deal's done, the next year, go back and review it. Like, see how your assumptions compared against what actually happened, because that's going to be a learning opportunity for you. And I think that the executive team and stuff will really appreciate that, that type of thinking, because it's really important to them and really important to the directors and the private equity investors, etc. So that's a really value-adding analysis that you can do. Okay, so the next, I believe the final learning is around synergies and kind of financial benefits. So a synergy is essentially a additional value benefit from a deal. So for example, Many we talked about earlier in the deck. So, for example, additional buying power, duplicate executive support team, upcharge at scale, systems and processes, anything which basically adds value to your business. Basically, a 1 + 1 = 3 is an example of a synergy. You bring the one from one business, you bring another one from another business, and then you get another one just because of efficiencies and all these other value adds. And if you're an investment banker, you're all about trying to maximize your fee, which means maximizing the purchase cost. So there's a lot of kind of dodgy synergy assumptions in a lot of investment banker decks. So I think number one, just be really wary of those and just be really conservative where you can in your synergy assumptions, because as we will touch on in the common issues section, is that there can often be a disconnect between those who are estimating those synergies, i.e. the deal team or the advisors or the investment bankers, who might have a different incentive to, for example, the deal team might be wanting to maximize them, whereas the ops team might be wanting to minimize them. So you often have these conflicts of interest, and there can be a disconnect. For example, the ops team might be thinking, well, actually, that's not achievable. You're saying that we're going to get a 300 basis point savings in COGS. Well, I've done this for many years and I know we can only get 200 basis points. Or you might be assuming that, we need to do this cost, but the ops person saying, well, actually, I don't have time to do this because I need to focus on my portfolio. You need to go and hire someone, and there's an extra 150K in there that all of a sudden wasn't factored in, right? It might be greater than the benefit that they're saving. So that's a common issue. There's the disconnect between those delivering and those estimating. The next common issue is that business cases pre-deal, often by advisors and deal makers, are sometimes there just to get a deal across the line, but when under scrutiny, don't often hold up. So anyone familiar with investment banking decks will know what I'm talking about, but investment bankers will try and get in every possible synergy they can and often just make up stuff, right? They'll be like, well, this company's been growing at this percent and they've gotten this amount of savings in the past, therefore they're going to get that in future. But what evidence is there that they will, just history isn't necessarily a reflection of the future. You got to think logically about it. They might have maximized all their savings from this particular area, right? Or it could be, we've brought these, deals, they're signed under non-binding indicative offer, therefore you need to include the Ebitda from them in the calculation. You do that, and then you realize that actually these deals aren't eventuating, and it's too late. Or they're saying, well, this person, this person is an integration cost. They're an M&A person. They do the acquisitions. Therefore, you need to normalize it out. You go ahead and realize that half their role is actually helping with the operations team, and actually they need to do acquisitions going forward, and therefore there's no synergy there. That's just a couple of examples. But if you look at an investment banking deck, you'll see that they've got, a typical bridge. They'll have 10 to 20 different kind of synergies. They just put the obvious ones, the 50-50 ones in the next bucket, and then they put these kind of long shot ones that are probably just absolute bullshit in the last category, and see how many they can get across the line. But they probably won't hold up under scrutiny. And the final common issue is that synergy delivery, i.e. the person and team who are actually charged with going out and actually getting that savings, this can often take a life of its own if the business case isn't formally baselined and updated during the integration. So, it could be a full-time job to get 100K savings. It might not be worthwhile. Or you might assume that you get all these savings in the first year, but you realize that because they take so long to do, it might actually take 3 years, or you can only do one at a time. So let's apply this to the case study and see what happened there. So it was, if you remember, because it was a public to private, it was difficult to involve the operations team in any assumptions planning and validation because of the confidentiality issues. We did avoid incorporating synergies into the deal because we weren't sure if they would eventuate. We thought they would, but we weren't sure, so we didn't factor them in. And also, we thought there was a high risk that there might be a hidden cost in there to absorb that upside. So, and that definitely did happen. So there was, additional staff that we needed to hire. There was additional cost that came on board. There was some staff that we ended up giving pay rises to. So for example, the CFO, the CMO, a lot of the executive team, the justification was, they're doubling their workload, therefore we need to give them pay rises. So we actually ended up giving away a lot of, not a lot, but we gave up a material amount of upside just in kind of staff incremental costs, because the CEO wanted to do that. So yeah, we weren't anticipating that. We didn't think that would happen, but it happened, and that's a hidden cost that you need to think about. So that's why you shouldn't factor these in. If you get a synergy, it should be upside for you. Next, there was staff duplication savings. So for example, you might have 2 CFOs, one was let go, or at the junior level, you might have a whole marketing team, one person leaves and you don't replace them because you've got enough capacity from the combined team. Or the outsourced team in the kind of finance team, we could kind of expand that and do less work from a couple of roles, and then over time, if they leave, then you don't need to replace them. So there was some staff duplication saving, but it was offset by buffer for integration resources and salary increases due to the new scale, which I talked about earlier. And finally, we did benefit post-acquisition from procurement savings, so about $1.5 million per year. This wasn't factored into the deal price, so there was significant upside from this. So that was a good outcome. And again, any savings you get, if you think about it, when we're paying a deal that might be a 15 times EBITDA multiple or a 10 times EBITDA multiple, let's just say it's 10 for easy math. A $1.5 million in savings in EBITDA, that's $15 million savings at the capital level, like the dollars you're putting in the business. So it's a lot of money. It's a lot of benefit. So what are the learnings from all of this? So number 1, validate the business case and any proposed synergies with those accountable delivering the team, i.e. get the deal team to talk to the operations team and validate your assumptions. Also be quite conservative where you can, and don't assume too much upside. Let that be, an upside case, but not your base case. Make sure you communicate the why, how, and when. Ensure those are realistic to the team so that they're achievable and on track with achieving those synergy delivery tasks. And finally, can't say this enough, but be really skeptical on synergies. They're probably not going to eventuate, and if they do, it's an upside, and or they might get offset by additional hidden costs, which you definitely haven't thought about. Even if you've factored in costs for an additional integration person, there's going to be some cost in the business that you just weren't expecting that's going to pop up, which you have to pay for. So yeah, those are really the key learnings. So now we can kind of go through the appendix, and this is just a couple of slides talking about, I guess more of the practical step side, because if you remember from the first video, we talked about, from my perspective, the only way to learn integrations is not to say you have to do this step, then this step, and this step, and this step, because every acquisition is different, and merger is different, and company is different, and issues are different. But B, if you just want to plan out the detailed level, you can do that logically. Just think about what you want to do at the conceptual level, and then what does that mean in terms of tasks, and then just planning that out in terms of timing and like who's going to do what. And also, you can just Google online and look up like an integration checklist and a Gantt chart template and use that. So there's no point me teaching you how to do those individual steps. I can definitely give you some templates for this. But yeah, in terms of processes, the best way to learn this is just to learn those high-level conceptual things. But in terms of practical examples of actual templates, yeah, something like this could be good. It's like, list all your steps in the left column. These are the goals that you want to achieve, and maybe categorize that into like one of the key issues, who's doing it, and then timeline, like when you're achieving it, like week 1, week 2, week 3, and then you can kind of color code it as to when things should be achieved. And then when you have your regular catch-up meetings, you can just make sure that you're heading on track. So in the background is what's called a Gantt chart, this colorful one, and this is one that you can. Each individual cell is a date and a task. So if you've missed one, it's very clear, and you can tick them off in your kind of like your team meetings. And this is basically how we approached it. So I'll share this template with you, and you can use this for your planning. Another practical example in this appendix is about like staffing. So, we have to go to a very detailed level about, what does the teams look like? Do some operational group charts where you kind of mapping out each individual person, who they're going to be reporting to. And also what we did was we did these scenario ones. So certain staff that we had been communicated were possible potential leavers. We had to do group structures with and without them in there so that even if they did leave, we were very well prepared to address that situation quickly. But obviously we were trying to address that with other things like transaction bonuses, long-term incentive plans, things like that to try and get them to stay. But obviously if they left, we can't control that, but we can plan ahead for it. Another example is conservative synergy assessment. So, we went through each possible area of synergy. We also went through each possible non-recurring cost as well. And we mapped out what is the likely, what is the conservative, what is the optimistic, just so we had a good idea as to where we would be in terms of situation. Then we checked that with relevant people where we could due to confidentiality, just to validate those. And then we mapped that out. And we didn't include this in the deal assumptions because it needed to be upside. But at least we had a good view early on and a realistic view as to what was achievable, etc. And also like a guide, because this would then convert into our integration and 100-day plan later on as to the things we needed to achieve and how we would do it and who would be doing it. And this is just an example of impaired Ebitda. So this could be a strategy that you might want to employ, but basically, if you remember earlier on, we identified some of the risks of the deal, which we covered in the first video. And the way we addressed these risks and got comfortable with it is we actually applied an internal Ebitda buffer. So we tried to do an estimate, a conservative estimate, as to what the impact on Ebitda would be if all of these risks came to fruition. And the impact on Ebitda was about $4.4 million, we calculated. And at the end of the day, most of these actually didn't eventuate, but at least in the most conservative state, we were still happy with the transaction. So we started off with about 24 million per the term sheet of Ebitda, or 25, I should say. And we applied our 4.4 million internal. So this wasn't in any deal transaction docs. It wasn't in any public record. It was just in our internal record, what we're comparing it against for the DD purposes. We got sign off with our private equity owners. Were they comfortable with this multiple? Because I think they were modeling out, they were expecting like a high 20x return, like 25x return on the group. So to them, even though this reduced our internal Ebitda to 20 mil and a probably internal multiple of 15 times instead of a 12.5 times, to them, this was still a very cheap deal. And this was before considering all the potential upside, like the COGS rebates, the staff savings, and also the things which are hard to assign a value, like the systems, the processes, the ability to be more disciplined longer term, accelerating the growth trajectory, the ability to deploy more capital behind the group, ability to have scale to invest in additional things like a strategy manager or an integration manager, and which add all these values, and maybe they'll come up with a new initiative to grow the business, etc. So there's hundreds of different benefits of doing it, but as long as they were most comfortable with the most conservative position, then it's all upside from there. And it also made management's life a lot easier, like the CEO, etc., because then they had a slightly more conservative target to compare against. And of course, we shot this out of the park. I think they're close to 30 mil Ebitda now, about 2 to 3 years later after the acquisition. So yeah, went really well. And so let's conclude the video now with a quote from Matthew Lester, who's a CFO. His quote is, many mergers fail. Why? I believe it's because, number one, there's a lack of knowledge of what fundamentally makes the company valuable and whether this can survive a merger, e.g. an entrepreneurial culture. And due diligence is often legal and financial as opposed to commercial, strategic, and cultural. So if I could just add in a comment there myself, speaking here, is that he's essentially saying it's the quantitative nature that advisors and M&A teams are used to. Numbers are easy to define, but culture and qualitative aspects of an integration are not. And not understanding this and not addressing this are the ways that you can actually make an integration fail and lose what's great about a company. All right, I'll keep going with the quote. The acquisition is defense. So this is his second point. The acquisition could be defensive in nature, i.e. it's an opportunity to cut costs, but it is presented to shareholders and investors as a growth deal. Expectations are not met and the deal is considered a failure. So this one is more about how the deal is being communicated and presented. And I guess I would refer back to our analysis on the MVC deal where we positioned it. We thought out we planned out exactly what's going to happen. We communicated it really well. We identified all the costs and said, this is what's going to happen. And then we positioned the worst possible scenario and said, are you happy with this? And that set the expectations exactly how we wanted it, and we vastly exceeded it. And then finally, his final point on Matthew is that integration is not properly planned. People are unclear about what should happen and can thus destroy the very thing that they have bought, e.g. by dismissing the very management that made the business valuable in the first place in favor of their own staff. So this point is an interesting one. It's like a combination of the planning point, so planning early and really going through in detail, including the quantitative as well as the qualitative. But it's also talking about the communication point, which is if you aren't communicating to both businesses and treating them as one integrated business, otherwise you risk kind of isolating them, and then you lose people and lose the culture, and then it's a failed acquisition. So, but again, as you can see, this is a quote text. There's many different variations of this. This is just one that I liked, but it's a good representation as to how everyone's identified issues around integrations can be different because it is qualitative, and why the only way that you'll really understand integrations and be good at integrations and minimize the risk that your acquisition will be one of the 80% that have failed is to really think about integrations from a conceptual standpoint. And once you understand those, then you'll be able to apply any post-merger integration with the right mindset to make sure it is successful, minimize issues, and extract the most value. So hopefully you found this video useful. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you've learned something. So see you later.